You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. Well, the world is in crisis, and everyone is stressed, and that's no way to greet the new year, much less the holidays, at the heart of which is the winter solstice. So today, this program will be one story that I wrote years ago for my son, then 8 years old. It became a book published by the feminist press, and it remains in print to this day. It's a story of wonder and transformation, and this is a time when we really need both. So I hope that this short novel, The Mer-Child, a legend for children and other adults, might be that story. Here it is. The Mer-Child. Once upon a time that may or may not come again, there lived a Mer-Child. He had pale green skin, translucent as sea foam, and his body sloped to a tail that glittered like a prism in the sun, each scale reflecting a different shimmer of the rainbow, crimson and cobalt, lilac and gold. His hair was surf white, ringleted as the froth that crests a wave. But his eyes were the strangest of all. They were speckled and whorled, like the spirals of the sundial shell. He was very beautiful. His mother was a mermaid, his father a human. Long, long ago they had fallen in love. For her sake his father, a mariner, forsook his own kind and entered the depths of the sea. His comrades thought him lost. The sea folk, in turn, forsook the mermaid, pronouncing her lost, for mermaids were not supposed to love mortals. The sea folk would not even own the mermaid's child, because it was half human. Only the dolphins pitied the lovers and remained their friends. Still, the mermaid and her mariner had one another. They loved their child dearly, of course, but their suffering had made them forever grown up, and they were now a special kind, complete unto themselves. The Mer-Child had no one of his own. He was very lonely. Sometimes he played with the young porpoises, leaping along the surface of the sea, stitching together air and water with one long, graceful thread of motion. Sometimes he sang with the great whales. Sometimes he joined in the favorite game of the whiskered walruses, in which you deliberately entangled yourself in seaweed chains and then tumbled through the depths, bouncing lightly against the coral reefs and bonking into one another. But the Mer-Child was, after all, not a young porpoise, or a great whale, or a whiskered walrus. He never quite belonged, and he was very lonely. He had tried to play with human children. The first time he ever saw one paddling about in the water, he swam right up and, not knowing what else to do, bonked playfully into it as he would into a friendly walrus. The child screamed and darted back to shore, where it babbled about sea monsters and was cooed over by laughing adult humans. Another time there was a tiny girl. She was not afraid, but she tried to catch the Mer-Child and drag him up onto the beach. He barely escaped. Once he saved a child from drowning, bearing him to the shallows and peeping from behind a rock while he staggered safely onto land. But when the child blurted out what had happened, his parents didn't believe him, and they forbade him the water again all that day for telling such a tall story. Still, another time he came across a group of girls and boys, all giggling and splashing, but they quickly covered their astonishment at seeing a Mer-Child by throwing stones at him and yelling, "There's something fishy about you," and then screeching with laughter. One summer, the Mer-Child actually did make friends, he thought, with a boy about his own age, a boy who seemed fearless and almost as at home in the water as the Mer-Child himself. But a day came when the boy insisted on racing him. Even though the Mer-Child refused again and again, and even though when he finally gave in, he then paddled as slowly as he knew how, still he reached the finish point long before his human companion. The boy turned on him, eyes aglow with hate, and sputtered, "Who cares, anyway? Who could be jealous of you? If your mother was a mermaid, then she lured your father to death, that's what. Mermaids do that to humans. Everybody knows they do. Your mother was a murderess and your father was a dummy. Or maybe your father tried to catch your mother and fry her up for dinner, huh? Ha ha, either way, it makes me want to throw up. It's so disgusting. And you're not a person or a fish. Freak, you don't fit in anywhere." "That's not true," cried the Mer-Child. "My mother and father loved each other. How could you ever understand them? He never tried to capture her, and she never tried to drown him. You're lying. All your stories about the sea folk are lies." "Oh, yeah," sneered the boy. He clambered up on some rocks and stood with his legs planted wide apart and his arms folded. He wiggled his toes. He bent his knees in a deep squat and then straightened up. He kicked out first one leg and then the other. He balanced on his left foot and waggled the right foot in the air, defiantly, as if it were a flag. "Let me see you do this, scaly tail. Race me on land and see who wins. You're not a real boy. I bet no self-respecting fish plays with you either. Else why are you hanging around people so much, huh? Where's all your fishy friends? Or are you Mr. Special Hot Stuff, the only Mer-Child in the whole world?" "What if I am? I mean," the Mer-Child stammered, "there are lots of other sea folk. Undines and Naiads and Tritons. There are water nymphs and river sprites and mer-ones, and they all love me. They play with me whenever I want and do whatever I ask them to." He fell silent, drenched with the shame of his lie. The boy was not impressed. Still jeering, he danced off further inland. But his taunts floated back to the Mer-Child in a sing-song snarl on the wind. Fish boy, you and your squid pals. You're not even real. I made you up. You never existed at all." The Mer-Child watched him go through shell-whorl eyes. After that, he didn't try to make friends with human children, although he often gazed at them from a distance, longingly. He learned that he could show himself from the waist up, and never too close. Then the children might wave, thinking him human like themselves, or sometimes they might even yell admiringly at him, "Hey, you're some swimmer." In the late afternoon, when their parents would call them in from the water to help gather up towels and picnic baskets from the beach, the children would point at him out beyond the breakers and whine enviously. "Look, that boy's still swimming. Why do we have to go? If that kid wants to stay in all night and get blue lips, that's his concern," a father would snap. "Where are his parents, anyway?" a mother would murmur, shading her eyes with one hand and squinting at the lone figure in the distance. "How can they let a child go swimming all alone at a cove like this, where there's no lifeguard? You, boy," she would sometimes call. "You better come in now. It's getting late." But the Mer-Child knew he must swim no nearer. He merely gazed at the creatures, bending and kneeling and straightening and wobbling along the sand. At last they would move off, Mother perhaps muttering, "I've never seen such a swimmer. I suppose he must know what he's doing. Maybe he's in training for the Olympics or something." Or a father might scold at his laggard offspring. "Will you hurry up? Stop staring backward and look where you're going. If some crazy kid wants to stay in the water this long and his parents don't care, it's none of our business." Yanking and shoving at one another, they would disappear up the path from the cove. The Mer-Child would watch them go through shell-whorl eyes. He would watch until the beach was utterly deserted, and then turn his gaze toward the vast, unbroken surface of the sea. Sometimes a sea swallow might fly overhead and drop him a gray-green feather, like a promise of pity. But he himself was not a sea swallow, or a fish, or a person. The sea folk would not own him. The human folk would not own him. The Mer-Child was very lonely. Summer ebbed slowly from the cove, and, as he had done in other years, the Mer-Child found himself missing even the few encounters, however distant or hurtful, with other children. For as the air grew cold, fewer and fewer humans came to the beach. Sometimes in autumn a single figure might be seen walking along the shoreline, but it was always an adult, and as the air grew sharper, even adult visitors were rare. The Mer-Child bobbed aimlessly on the choppier waves, bored. One day, as he was wondering whether to follow the dolphins to the southern seas, or go ride the Gulf Stream, or visit the Great Barrier Reef, he heard the overhead calls of startled sea swallows, and he looked up to see the glossy, black-helmeted birds dip and swoop their pearlish gray-green bodies out to sea, as if they'd been surprised during their stroll along the shore. But there, on the beach itself, moving slowly across the sand toward the outcropping of rock, was what seemed at first a bulk with a double head, but which soon became a man carrying a human bundle, what looked like a child wrapped warmly in sweaters and blankets. The man set the child down on a rock and settled himself alongside. For a while they gazed out at the sea, seeming to talk now and then, until the man drew a pad from his pocket and began to sketch. Then, after a while, he lifted the child again and carried his bundle up the path from the cove. The Mer-Child was curious. The next day the strange pair was back, and the next. Within the week the man had begun to leave the child tucked safely into a blanketed nest along the rock outcropping, which gave her a fine view of the sea. He would then go for short walks, returning with shells he had gathered or a drawing he had made of the seascape around the bend of the beach. The child, meanwhile, sat peacefully on the rock perch, sometimes reading a book, but mostly just looking out to sea, often singing a wordless little song, unashamedly loud against the crash of surf. The Mer-Child watched all this through shell-whorl eyes. The human child seemed lonely. One day he dared swim nearer. He hid behind a jut in the natural sea-wall of rocks in order to see the small human more closely. From his hiding place he could spy on the odd person who was, he thought, a little girl, although he couldn't be certain. She seemed to him like no other child he had ever seen. For one thing, she appeared to move only from the waist up, whenever she reached for her book or leaned to adjust the blankets tucked about her legs which never seemed to move. She didn't scramble over rocks or run along the sand or even walk, and she never swam. But her voice went places her body didn't. It bounced off the rock surfaces and echoed over the waves. The Mer-Child thought he had never heard anything so beautiful as her queer, mournful melodies, although they did remind him a little of the courting songs of the humpback whale. Her singing seemed to draw him closer. He edged in, still hiding. She was indeed like no other child. Her skin was not pink like that of many early summer children who came to the cove, nor was it the rich glazed black of the island children on the other shore, the far side of the sea. Instead, she seemed to glow as if from some inside brightness that flickered through the silvery seal brown of all her surfaces, the face and hands giving off light like a sun-spotted flounder, the eyes almost green-black as the ocean floor and shot with the same tawny flecks. Her hair was short and exclaimed itself in a rush of wiry, tight black curls all over the proud little head. When the wind touched her hair, that head looked like a sea anemone riffling itself under water, or so the Mer-Child thought. Sometimes, to his amazement, she bent her graceful neck and buried that head in her arms. Then peculiar sounds came from her, more like the grunts of a sea robin than the whale song melodies he loved so. When she lifted her head again, her eyes seemed to have rained tiny rivers down her cheeks. The Mer-Child puzzled all this from his hiding place and did not understand. Yet she was lonely. That he recognized. The day came when her father had made certain she was comfortable in her perch, and had gone a bit away to set up his easel and paints, and she turned to find her book, but saw, wedged cunningly in the crack beside her usual place, a circle of seaweed, as if woven into a crown. She smiled, then placed it promptly on her stiff black curls and sat looking out to sea, a small monarch surveying her immense realm. The circlet had dried brittle by the afternoon's end, but she kept it, pressing it in her book. The next day she found a piece of driftwood in the crevice, a curve of creamy bark scoured by water and salt into a shape like interlocking wings arched above a double bird body. The next day she deliberately waited until her father was far off down the beach, savoring the expectation. Then she looked. There, in the treasure crevice, was wedged a shard of mottled blue glass, its edges worn smooth by tidal scrubbings. She peered through it at the sun and saw a horizon, blue-green as if she looked up through sea-water into air. The next day her father offered to sit with her a while, but she impatiently urged him to get on with his painting, and only when quite alone did she dare search beside her, down between the stones. Fragile but perfect, a sand dollar lay there, nestled on a cushion of sea moss. The next day, the shell, strung by its natural hole on a velvet ribbon the color of willow leaves, hung round her slender throat. Her father would comment in surprise on his return each afternoon. "The sea must like you to wash up gifts like these," he smiled, as he lifted her into his arms. But privately he thought how well she had learned to see treasures right around her, unlike other children who were freer to ignore their immediate surroundings, given the luxury of movement that let them explore wherever they wished. She herself said little, but she always took her treasures with her, and once, when a light rain caused her father to sweep her up in a hasty departure, she made him turn back to retrieve the black and yellow streaked pebble she had found that day. All this the Mer-Child watched through shell-whorl eyes. Day after day he watched her from his hiding place, just the other side of the rock outcropping. Hour after hour, the two of them watched in silence on either side of the seawall, gazing out to sea. It was she who spoke first. "Thank you," she said simply, in the clear voice he knew so well from her singing. "Thank you for my treasures." The Mer-Child was so shocked at being addressed directly that he flipped from his ledge by reflex and splashed loudly into the water. He had darted 2 miles out to sea with excitement before he could slow down and tell himself calmly that she doubtless had been talking to the waves and not to him at all. Ashamed of himself, but unable to keep away, he alternately glided and inched back to his observation place. The little girl still sat on her rock, but she seemed to be smiling to herself, and she hummed softly as she tickled her chin with a sea-swallow feather that had been that day's gift. They spent the rest of the afternoon in silence, although the waves did seem excessively loud. The next day, as they took up their positions on the seawall, she spoke the moment her father was out of earshot. "I'd bring you gifts in return, you know, but I don't get about much. I couldn't gather land flowers or bird feathers or pine cones very easily, you see." The Mer-Child clung to his ledge for dear life and strained to hear her over the thudding of his heart, which whammed in repeated tidal waves against his ribs. He told himself again, "Don't be a fool. She's talking to the sea. She doesn't even know you exist." But then she seemed to twist her upper body toward him and call directly across the rock that separated them. "I thought of bringing you a book, you know, but I couldn't think whether a child like you would care for reading. Besides, all my books are about the sea life, which is hardly something you need to learn about." The child's tidal wave heart seemed to stop, and he found himself seriously wondering whether it would ever start again. But start it did. Although from the delightful melting sensation that came over him, he all at once realized how a jellyfish must feel. He wriggled a few inches closer. He edged himself up toward the top of the seawall. Holding his breath, he peeked over the barrier rock. The little girl was looking directly into his eyes. "Anemone," was all he could manage. "Anne who?" she asked. "Anne, sea anemone," he whispered. "Anemone," he repeated foolishly. "Like your head." Then, overcome with embarrassment, he slid down from his rock and vanished in the next wave. The little girl serenely went back to her singing. Still, that was the beginning. The space that separated the two grew smaller day by day, the Mer-Child lying at last in full view of the little girl, although still hidden from sight of anyone on the beach. The afternoons grew shorter as autumn sifted toward darkness. But the conversations grew longer, so much so that the little girl's father wondered if his daughter had taken to talking to herself in her loneliness. He could see her up on her beloved throne, as she called it, from his walk along the beach or his position with his paints. She seemed to be in animated conversation with the sea itself, gesturing with those strong little arms that tried to compensate for the motionless legs. Yet he trusted his daughter's wisdom. He had learned she knew, as well as anyone, sometimes better, what she needed for her own survival. She did, in fact, seem happier than he had ever seen her. As for the Mer-Child, he could no more be kept from his daily appointment then the tide could be kept from coming in. He was delirious. He would chase his own tail with joy. "Your eyes," she announced one day, "are nice. Weird and shivery. Dizzy-making, but nice. Did you know that?" The Mer-Child allowed as how he hadn't known that. He got suddenly shy, but his tail tip twitched with pleasure in the shallows. "Well," she went on matter-of-factly, "they are. They sort of spiral. They seem to look in and out at the same time. And they shine so." "Do you cry often?" she asked abruptly. "Cry? Like the gulls, you mean?" "Well, no. You know, cry tears. I mean, weep." "I don't know what weep is," replied the Mer-Child, feeling shamed by his ignorance. "I cry a lot sometimes," the little girl confessed, in a low voice, as if she hadn't heard his admission. Slowly it came to him that she meant when her eyes rained rivers. "Oh," he blurted out, "I know when you cry. You weep and your eyes waterfall. I've never done that. I don't even know if I can. Is it to be sad or happy?" "I think it can mean either one, or both," she answered. "But I've only ever wept from being sad." "Ah," the Mer-Child replied. And they said no more that day. But on other days they talked of many things. She asked his name, and he replied that he had none, and he felt ashamed again until she laughed and said that that was wonderfully perfect because he had no need of a name since he was the only Mer-Child in all the world and one of a kind. He never thought to ask her name then, since she too was obviously the only one of her kind in all the world. She was simply the little girl. He did ask her at last, though, why she never moved, or walked, or swam. He asked her very tenderly, as if the question might hurt her, even if he couldn't think why it would. "Oh," she said slowly, "I can't, you see. My legs are paralyzed. That means they won't move or hold me up. Of course, my father says someday there might be a medicine or operation or cure of some sort. You never know. But until then, and maybe for always, my body's like other children's, only from the waist up." Her eyes, like twin undersea springs, welled up with shadowy water. Fascinated, the Mer-Child stared, until he realized that she was grieving. "Please," he cried, "please don't be sad." He reached out to touch her for the first time. "I know what you feel. I know. My body is also like other children's, from the waist up only." His cool hand, with its exquisitely webbed fingers, grasped her strong brown one and held it tight. Then she burst into laughter, right through her tears, and said, "Of course, I never thought of it that way. As if I were a sort of a mermaid. It makes us two of a kind, then. How lovely! Oh, lovely, lovely, lovely." She squeezed his hand, then dropped it to clap hers in celebration. The Mer-Child, too, broke out in smiles, and, imitating her, beat his hands one on the other in welcome. Theirs was a special world, all unto themselves, its only reality the few hours each afternoon when the little girl's father left her, and watched from a distance until the dreaded moment came when he had to gather her up and carry her home again. Between those moments and their return the next day lay unreal, endless hours for each child. Hours of going through the motions of living as if in a dream. Only when they were together did the Mer-Child and the little girl feel fully awake. There was no confidence they couldn't share, She told him how her legs had been useless since her babyhood, probably damaged in the same accident that had taken the life of her never-known mother. She showed him a photograph of that mother, a halibut-skinned woman with the same anemone hair and a smile that warmed your own until you found you were grinning back at the square piece of picture paper. She told him how her father somehow thought the doctors hadn't done all they could have, how her father thought that was because he and her mother weren't welcome in that hospital, since they loved each other but had different color skins. No matter how often she explained this, the Mer-Child couldn't understand it. Her parents had both been human, hadn't they? And the doctors, too? Patiently, the little girl tried to tell him some of the ways in which humans often saw themselves as being of different kinds. They returned to this conversation again and again. It isn't only the shade of skin or hair or eyes you see. Look, I knew a girl once at school. She cleared her throat as if telling a story. And this girl liked to play a game with a ball and a wooden stick that mostly boys play. I wasn't much interested in it myself because you had to run a lot, and of course anyway, the boys wouldn't let her play this game just because she was a girl. Well, human children aren't always kind, the Mer-Child argued diplomatically, remembering his own experiences. But don't you see? The children only copy what the grown-ups do. My doctor, the nice one I have now, she says some men tried to stop her from becoming a doctor because she was a woman. But aren't they all human? He would persist. To change the subject, the little girl would ask about the sea, and the Mer-Child would enchant her with stories of the ocean floor, its valleys and volcanoes, meadows and mountain chains. He described the irresistible pull of undersea eddies. He let her ride the great tsunami, the giant Pacific wave, through his words. He made the magic of the male seahorse giving birth come alive for her. But always they returned to sameness and difference. Aren't all humans more alike than different? He asked. Yes, but they don't always see it that way, she sighed. Older ones sometimes don't trust young ones, and younger ones can be cruel to old ones. It's so mean. My father's family didn't want him to marry my mother, nor hers to marry him. Then, after she died, he was so angry at all of them, he said he didn't need their help. He would raise me all by himself, even though he's an artist and not rich. The Mer-Child knew by now what artist meant, from the easel and paints and sketches, but rich was a new category. What's rich? He almost winced to ask. The little girl sighed again. Sometimes each explanation required another, she had discovered. Rich is when you have more stuff than others do, who are then called poor. Rich people don't like poor ones, and poor ones don't like rich ones right back. But aren't they all human? Yes, she anticipated. And you promised to tell me how the female dolphins help the mother dolphin give birth to her baby. So he told her about the dolphin midwives. And he told her how the sun didn't set for months on end over the summertime Greenland sea, and which deep-sea fish were luminous, and how fairy shrimp swam upside down. He told her that sponges were animals, not plants, and he described for her the swift underwater grace of the huge leathery turtle, so unlike its lumbering gait on land. Her father did wonder how, even with all the books she'd read, she could know so much about the sea. He wondered how rare shells from the South Pacific could wash up unbroken on a North Atlantic shore, how strange names like whelk and stomia and manatee could come so readily to his daughter's lips. But he was a wise father and said nothing, rejoicing in his daughter's happiness. Still, at every chance, the Mer-Child's curiosity about humanity drew him back to that subject as surely as the moon draws up the tides. Why, he thought out loud to her, as if he were part of her or she part of himself, don't the rich just give some of their being rich to the poor ones? The poor ones could give back some of their being poor. Then each one could be different, but together they'd all be the same. You know what I mean? It's like each carp and snapper is different from every other, but they're all fish. And fish are different from crabs or coral, but they're all sea creatures. And each of the sea folk is special, but we're all part of one family, she cut in gently. And they both fell silent, thinking of what he had told her about his own family, how his human father and mermaid mother each had been cast out from their own folk for the sake of their love, the love that had given him birth. He looked down at the trumpet triton shell she was cradling, a gift he had brought her from a dashing overnight swim all the way to Trinidad, the island where her mother had been born. Then he murmured, "My mother once said that beings crowd together and move against other beings because each one feels separate and scared, alone in the universe." "My father said something like that once," the little girl whispered back. "He was painting a portrait of my mother from memory, and he started to cry. You know, his eyes began to rain rivers. And he came and rocked me in his arms and said over and over, like a song almost, 'So alone, each of us, forever.' That's what your mother and I broke through for a while." The Mer-Child and the little girl sat together, holding hands. Only the sound of the youngest waves could be heard, plashing mildly against the rock base. It was the middle of October. One day the little girl was unusually quiet. It was only as the afternoon lengthened toward dusk that she burst out, "Tomorrow we must leave." The Mer-Child felt as if a sudden undertow had gripped his mind and was tugging it away from his body. "Leave? Where? How? You can't leave," he stammered wildly. "I'll follow you. I'll come wherever you can't go." In his despair, he thrashed himself against the seawall, leaving scales of mangled iridescence on the rocks. His friend strained to catch the webbed fists pounding the stones in panic. Finally, she caught and clasped them tightly in her hands. "You can't follow me, dearest Mer-Child," she cried. "Not where we're going. It's far inland where we live. We only came to the cove because my doctor said sea air would be good for me, and we came in after summer season because we couldn't afford what they call the real vacation months, and now we have to go. But maybe we can come again next." Then the sea robin's sobs rose from her throat and blurred in the wind with the unearthly moans the Mer-Child keened. All that gray October afternoon they sang this way, for their loss of one another, on the wet rocks by the autumn sea. Only when her father approached did they release one another. Only then did she whisper, more like a prayer to no one than a promise to anyone, "Perhaps next year." But the Mer-Child, retreating to his huddle behind the seawall, watched in mute grief how she was plucked like a sea anemone from her rocky home and borne away to land. He watched all this through shell-whorl eyes and did not cry. This is a song the sailors sing, though none knows how it came to be. Some say a voice from the waves would ring out in the night, bitterly free, sighing, "What is so cursed as an autumn sea? Now you are lost, lost, lost to me." All through the ice and wind and snow, none could find how it came to be. That voice would mock the sailor's show of fear, where he knelt on stiffened knee, chanting, "What is so damned as a winter sea? Once you are lost, lost, lost to me." In April drenched, in May becalmed, none dare gain where the voice might be, but that song would echo like a psalm above the sailor's scurvy plea, mourning what is so doomed as a springtime sea, and you still lost, lost to me. In August oven or monsoon none might win, yet could it be this voice seemed at last a clue, a rune, to a sailor's blistered soul, the key unlocking even to such as we. What love can be found on a summer sea, gained, won, or saved, with you lost to me? All that winter and spring and summer the Mer-Child roamed the waters of the world, finding summer and autumn and winter on the other side of the planet. But none of the seasons or wonders of ocean or river, brook, bay, inlet, stream, or open sea could tempt his interest or penetrate his sorrow. The clownish dolphins could not coax an answering smile from him, and the whiskered walruses, after many tries, gave up attempting to involve him in their old shared pastime. His only comfort seemed to be in wandering alone along the ocean floor, and exploring its caves until he spied great undulating clumps of sea anemones. To these flower-like creatures he would drift and crawl like a wounded thing, and rest his head amidst their beckoning tentacle petals. Late northern hemisphere summer came, and with it terror and hope so mingling in his thoughts that the Mer-Child barely let himself know what he was doing as he returned to the familiar cove. There, from far out beyond the sandbar and the breakers, he watched the final summer stragglers litter and then desert the beach, group by group, family by family, one by one. Then they were gone. The air grew sharper, the water grew colder, the waves grew choppier. No one else came. Finally, late one afternoon, the Mer-Child turned his back toward land and his face toward the wide sea, admitting to himself that she would not return. And he began to swim into that emptiness, except that the sharp, quick calls of startled sea swallows froze him in mid-stroke. He paused, heart bursting with dread and longing, and slowly turned again to see, moving slowly across the sand, toward the outcropping of rock, a man carrying what looked like a child wrapped warmly in sweaters and blankets. The Mer-Child leapt from the water as the dolphins had taught him, high, high into the air for pure praise, and then sped like the sea arrows toward land, toward her. She was settled in place by the time he arrived, cozily tucked in, breathing rapidly with her own excitement, having imperiously and a bit rudely dismissed her amused father. A somewhat withered ear of corn, the most inlandish object she could think of, lay tied with a red bow into the crevice where the Mer-Child had always placed his gifts for her. She sat head high, hands folded neatly in her lap, the sand dollar magically still unbroken and secure on its willow-green ribbon around her neck. Each fin and scale and pore quivering with delight, the Mer-Child flung his whole prismatic length alongside on the rock, panting, laughing, exhausted, exhilarated beside her. Then she reached out and laid a small brown hand on all that heaving rainbow, I came back, she said. So that was the second summer, even better than the first. That was the summer she told him about her room at home, about her little aquarium and pet angelfish, about school, about how as they grow older, the children tease her less but ignore her more as they run off to their games and their lives. That was the summer where he sang her the song he had made up when he feared her lost to him forever. That was the summer they sang together, low enough so that her father down the beach couldn't hear, but also low enough so that the sea sound waves bore their melody out to the great whales, who walled in answering refrain. That was the summer she declared she knew what she wanted to be when she grew up, a notion that disconcerted the Mer-Child more than he showed. An oceanographer, she pronounced proudly. That's what I'll be. A scientist who studies all about the sea and sea life, marine biology they call that, and helps preserve the world's oceans and sea folk from pollution and destruction and things. There were so many new words in her announcement that it took her an entire afternoon to explain them all to the Mer-Child, but he liked each explanation more and more, nodding his surf-white ringlets vigorously as she outlined her plan. Clearly, this meant that she would always be near the sea. Just as clearly, it seemed to him a superb idea. That was the summer he brought her the rare black pearl. That was the summer she told him that her father said the black pearl she had found could buy her the best education any oceanographer ever had. That was the summer she read to him the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Little Mermaid. He found it marvelously sad, and he was astonished to discover that his mother was so famous as to be in a human's book, even if the storyteller did get some of the facts wrong. And that was the summer, he said. I bet you could swim. At first she was shocked and frightened, but he explained how every creature was lighter in water, even fish and merwans. Remember the leathery turtle, he asked, and he told her how he himself never kicked when he swam. How could he, without legs? But instead sort of arched his back the way she herself did when she stretched, and mostly stroked and spun and wove the water about with his arms. Then there was pure floating, of course, and the simple trick of riding the waves and letting the water do all the work. And they spent hours talking about it, how he would teach her to bob and skim and coast the wave roll, and how together they could roam the world's waters and he could show her their secrets. What an oceanographer she'd be then. That was the summer they dreamed together. But it was a dream. The wind of late autumn breathed its chill along the sheltered cove, and the time of their parting drew near. Again, wild loneliness was borne in upon the Mer-Child. Again, the little girl wept for both their sakes. Then she was gone. Repeating to himself the memorized words of Andersen's story, and absurdly clutching a withered ear of corn, the Mer-Child swam slowly seaward and did not cry. Like a wheel the year turned. The sea breathed its tidal rhythms more slowly, or so it seemed to the Mer-Child, than ever before. Perfect snowflakes fell unseen by any eye onto the blank face of the open sea, each crystal as brief and unique as an hour the Mer-Child and the little girl had shared. Spring came, and the wild geese flew northward, their calls like alarms to waken the coastline before them. Then summer warmed the surface of the northern seas, and the great sperm whales moved massively through the depths toward their mating grounds. The Mer-Child had visited the giant glaciers of the South Pole, and had permitted electric eels, who were more show-offs than helpers, to light his way through sea-black caverns no mer one had ever traveled. He had rescued 6 baby dolphins from tuna nets, and courteously disengaged 2 deep-sea divers from a disagreement with an irritated squid. Their story of the odd hero who saved them was never believed. The crew aboard their boat said they had experienced depth mirage, and in time they too came to believe the Mer-Child had been a hallucination. But none of these adventures could, for the Mer-Child, be as precious as a single quiet conversation with his friend. This year, though, he had faith she would return, and as summer waned, he turned with a quickening pulse toward the direction of the familiar coast. He had not expected obstacles. There were undersea earthquakes that season, caused, it was thought, from offshore explosions by humans testing strange new weapons. Whole landscapes shifted underwater. Sunken galleons moored on the seafloor for 1,000 years now rose and drifted through the churning fathoms like ghost ships. The Mer-Child was pinned for 2 days beneath an ancient Phoenician galley that had been dislodged and then had sunk again on him. When he finally squirmed free, he had to force his way through schools of maddened fish, darting in terror from debris and from equally terrified predators. The mystical balance of the sea had been disturbed, and until it righted itself, all would be chaos beneath the surface. The Mer-Child helped where he could, but he kept fighting his way back to the cove, back to the little girl, who would be, where? Safe from this disaster? He knew he must get to her, though to save her or save himself he could not have told. He knew only what was driving him, an energy strong as that propelling the salmon upstream to spawn each year, risking death as if it were a mere inconvenience that might slow one down, like the waterfall to be leapt up, like the Sargasso swamp to drag oneself across, like the weariness and hunger, the flesh scarred, the scales broken, but the passion intact. The water grew colder, and he knew as he broke the choppy surface waves that the air had grown sharper. He was late, very late. Before him, in the near distance, there lay the cove, tranquil as ever on a sun-brilliant afternoon, the coastline eroded by fractions only his skilled glance could detect. Was it possible, then, for humans to cause such a catastrophe undersea and remain completely unaffected themselves on land? He realized how little human beings really knew about the ocean, and how little most appeared to care. But all of this, and his own painful cuts and gashes and aches of exhaustion, seemed to slide away from his consciousness as he approached the cove, and the anticipated meeting with his friend fountained new strength through him. He was prepared that she might, this time, have reached their meeting place before him. Indeed, he was secretly terrified that she might already have left. But he was not prepared for what he saw. 2 separate figures were moving slowly down the path toward the beach. One was a familiar tall shape, complete with easel and sketch pad and paint box. But the other? It was the little girl, but standing, or almost standing, almost walking, if it could be called that. Shiny spines, like scales glittering in the sun, gleamed along both her legs, and she leaned on 2 strange wooden masts. With the aid of these and a hand from her father, she lurched and stumbled toward the sea-wall. The Mer-Child was frantic for her to be settled, her father dispatched, and some explanation made of this extraordinary change. Were these then scales, in fact? Had she become some kind of walking mermaid? He thought her capable of marvels. He flailed like a beached minnow in his haste for news. But in good time she did arrive, and as soon as her father had turned back to the beach, she called out a greeting to the Mer-Child. But her face clouded over with concern when she saw his condition, and she refused to give her explanation until he gave his. Only after she could be reassured by first-hand inspection that his wounds were relatively minor would she answer his flurry of questions, explaining in a glad voice what her shining tails, as he called them, were. "Braces," she said, and showed him how they held her up the same way its exoskeleton held a lobster together. The wooden masts had nothing to do with the ship and weren't masts at all. She called them crutches. She could lean her upper body's weight on them for further support. In time, she said, she might even be able to do without one or the other braces or crutches, but that depended on how she could build up what her doctor called muscle tone. "And that," she bubbled, her dark eyes flashing their gold flecks in merriment, "is where you come in, my dear friend." The Mer-Child was confused. "I'm all at sea," he frowned, using an expression he had learned struck her as particularly funny. The little girl brought out her news as if it were the greatest treasure she might offer. "I'm to learn to swim." There was a great thwack somewhere below the Mer-Child's pale green chest, but above his rainbow-scaled tail. He suspected it was his stomach, completely flopping over inside him. "Yes," she almost sang, "I'm to learn to swim. None of this would have happened if it hadn't been for your idea that I might move in water better than on land. I asked my father if such an idea could possibly work. I didn't tell on you, of course. And then he asked my doctor, and then she said maybe I was, after all, ready for what they call water therapy. And so all last winter and spring, they kept dipping me into shallow pools at the clinic, and I did special exercises and learned to float and develop my arms, and then I got these braces, and now here I am, and I'm allowed into the water, out to that boy, my father says, but with a lifeline and probably water wings. Oh, my own dear Mer-Child, how can I thank you for what you've done?" All in a rush it came, like hurricane winds, but bringing gusts of hope. That was the summer they talked less, because her father hovered nearer. The Mer-Child watched daily while her father carried, then floated his daughter out along a lifeline to the buoy. It was at least a week before she could convince her father to leave her alone, swearing to remain knotted to the buoy on her line and wearing the ridiculous orange water wings the Mer-Child, a bit too honestly, had announced made her look like a sunburned blowfish. But finally it happened. And there, out beyond the breakers, secure within the sheltering cove, but equally secure from well-meaning fatherly interruption, the Mer-Child joined her. They were alone, and swimming together, she as light and free as the Mer-Child, who circled her with the greatest watchfulness, scolding her more than her father did when she let go of the lifeline for a second, but laughing with glee at her courage and at the way she made herself at home in his element. Never had there been such an afternoon. That was the summer the little girl grew taller and stronger and more certain of herself. That was the summer the Mer-Child, for the first time, found himself afraid of what the sea's power could do. That was the summer the little girl's father pretended to believe her story of the tame porpoise, who sometimes bobbed alongside her out there when she swam unattended. That was the summer the Mer-Child and the little girl sat together in the warm shallows while her father napped on a blanket up the beach. The Mer-Child showed her how thousands of tiny coquina shells buried themselves in the soaked sand, and made air bubbles after each wave receded. They scooped up handfuls of sand and sifted out shell after shell of peach and periwinkle and azure, magenta striping lavender, gray swirling around chartreuse, each creature designed like no other, perfect and alone, each buried in sand, but releasing its solitary bubble upward like a signal. Nobody fits anywhere, except in not fitting, he mused softly. But all life once fitted in the sea, she answered. At least it all came from there. You fit, he murmured, in water now. Almost, she whispered, just like you almost fit on land. Of course, one element we haven't tried is air. She squinted up at the sun-splashed blue above them. I wonder if we'd fit there. At any rate, he smiled, we fit with each other. Here, finally, we belong. Yes, we belong. Then the Mer-Child felt inside him a tearing, as when whole sections of the sea floor had been ripped apart in the earthquake. His throat seemed as if it would rupture with unspoken words. Wave shine, shell stripe, silver-brown skin, and anemone hair above eyes black with pain and love, all shimmered together in the sea sun. The light stung his eyes. Oh, look, she cried, just as you knew that I could swim, as if that would make me a sea being, so I knew that you could weep, as if that would make you a human. She touched her fingertip to his wet face and brought away a tear. Amazed, he did the same. He tasted this river his own eyes had rained. It tastes of salt, he exclaimed. It tastes like the sea. Mine too, she laughed through her own tears, and he touched and tasted hers as well. It's as if humans kept a sign of the mother sea in ourselves, a secret token of grief or gladness. But I'm not sad, the Mer-Child said. I've never been so happy. Nor I, wept the little girl. That was the summer they discovered the tears of joy, under a canopy of gulls and sea swallows wheeling in the sun. Even today, there is a legend told along the rocky coasts of North America. It's difficult to know where the legend begins and where the true story leaves off, although many people will admit to having actually met the famous oceanographer who returned year after year, decade after decade, in late summer to one special cove. For years, they say, during her youth and middle age, she had come regularly to swim in this spot, her powerful arms and upper body making her a fine swimmer, despite the withered legs that trailed through water after her, almost like a tail. They say she had a way with all sea creatures, with gulls gone lame or baby octopi washed ashore, or the occasional curious seal exploring the rocky promontory. They say the year of the oil spill from the wrecked tanker she was a wild woman, furious as a sea squall while she directed the cleanup operation. They say she toured beaches all over the globe, not merely to collect specimens as easily as she collected prizes and honors in the cities and universities of the world, but to go swimming. To go swimming. And they say she was as graceful in water as she was awkward on land. They tell how she never married, but loved children. They tell, too, how she became stooped with age and limped more heavily than ever, how she would inch along the beach toward the cove in chilly autumn, and firmly refuse the company of others, how she would sit for hours, far out along the sea wall, talking to herself the way old people do, sometimes laughing out loud or singing at the sea. She had a friend, some say, who sat with her, or seemed to. Stories differ about this, but it appeared from a distance to be an old man, someone with white hair, that was certain. Nobody ever met this companion. He was never seen to accompany the famous old oceanographer into town or during her walks along the beach. The legend they tell still along the rock coasts of the North Atlantic has it that on the night of the great storm, the old woman was seen willfully lumbering her way down to the cove. A child had tried to stop her, but, as the child reported later, the old woman had patted her on the head and told her to run home quick and get safe from the coming storm. The woman had said she'd be fine, that the child was not to worry. And before turning to the sea, she had pressed a perfect sand dollar into the child's small palm. That night, the wind and the sea met in the wildest howling dance ever witnessed by that coast. The sea-wall crumbled into pebbles and was washed away, and as it fell with a great crash, dolphins far out in the open ocean clicked in concert and smiled their wise secrets at one another. In the indifferent dawn, the coastline was forever altered, the water's surface and the sky's bowl scrubbed clean of any sign of life. As for the famous old oceanographer, she was never seen again along the coast or anywhere. The human folk, of course, say that she was drowned. The sea folk doubtless believe that he, in turn, was lured by her onto land, which would explain his disappearance from their depths on that same night. But two such souls as these, long, long past fitting anywhere but in the transformations each made possible for the other, might have given this story a different ending. An ending suspected by that same child when she stood the next morning on the storm-swept beach, still clasping the sand dollar in her hand. She was watching how, from far out at the horizon where water met sky, two sea swallows came gliding toward her, air swimmers of ease and skill. They dipped and then ascended, nearer and nearer, until they were wheeling above her head, and she could see them clearly. Pearlish gray-green their bodies were, their heads sleek with dark silver-brown helmets, identical, except that one had a marking of bright willow green ringing the throat. Or was that a trick of the light? Then, interweaving their wakes of flight with one another, they rose again, and, beating their four wings as with one pulse, flew out into the sunrise and disappeared. And that's our show for this week. May your holidays and your new year be filled with peace. This program will be on hiatus until January. You can follow me on social media at The Robin Morgan. You can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net, and you can find my new novel, Parallax, and my just-out new book of poems, Harvesting Darkness, wherever books are sold. Portions of this program were taped earlier. Views expressed here do not necessarily represent the WMC. Here's the family for Women's Media Center live. Executive producer, as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer for this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us next time on Women's Media Center Live.